Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Female Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Danny, and today I'm going to talk about transitioning from bodybuilding or training for physique development to functional fitness or training for performance. This is a highly requested topic for me to cover on the podcast and on Instagram. So I was really excited to get around to recording this episode. And I really, really hope that you guys find value from it. And if any questions do come up whilst I'm talking to you, please feel free to write them down and drop me a message on Instagram. I absolutely love hearing from you guys. So please do not hesitate to reach out. There's never any such thing as a stupid question. And I'm always more than happy to help however I can. So, you've spent years chasing the perfect physique in your eyes, or trying to build your physique in line with a certain criteria, trying to chase as much muscle growth as possible, or as much fat loss as possible through certain phases. And now you're stepping into the world of functional fitness. It can be so confusing and so overwhelming because it's just so different from what you're used to. I've obviously been through this transition myself, and I've taken so many clients through it as well. It can be so challenging and incredibly humbling as well in so many ways. But do you know what? It can also be one of the most rewarding transitions that you will ever go through. I have obviously been through it myself, and I've experienced a lot of challenges going through that transition with my health, with my mobility, my ego taking a hit at certain periods of time. My body image was challenged when I went through certain phases in that transition away from training for physique development to training for performance, and dabbled in things like CrossFit and developed muscle tissue in areas that I wasn't used to carrying muscle tissue, and lost muscle tissue in areas that I was used to having more. And it took a while to get used to that, and also to learn how to structure training well so that I could balance getting better at multiple different things rather than purely training to build maximal muscle tissue like I used to, or lose body fat like I used to. But it is one of the most transformative things I have ever done. It's completely changed my relationship with training, making it so much more enjoyable. When prior to moving into the kind of what you would call functional fitness space, I was so bored of training like a bodybuilder. I just kind of felt like every time I would go to the gym, I was forcing myself to go, and I was kind of just going through the motions by the end of it. And it just wasn't giving me the stimulation that I needed, and it wasn't bringing me any joy anymore. So I knew I needed to change things up, and I do still incorporate some hypertrophy work across my training week. You don't have to completely abandon it, but starting to incorporate training to build my fitness levels and move in different ways and improve my overall strength and mobility and my power, and learn to move in different ways has just been such an amazing experience. And I actually remember when I first made this transition personally, I started to go to a CrossFit box, and I went to some of the classes there. And I just remember it feeling like my brain had been lit up when I started training in a different way. It was like just being able to incorporate skills that I hadn't tried before and get better at new things was so stimulating, and it made my sessions so much more immersive when before I was just so bored and not because I was so much like I'd kind of got so complacent with my training. I could train like a bodybuilder like the back of my hands. I didn't really have to plan my sessions out too much. I was obviously taking a decent amount of rest between my sets, and during that rest, I'd just find myself scrolling my phone and trying to look for stimulation elsewhere as opposed to being focused on the session and enjoying the session in front of me. So that this transition has just been amazing for me in so many ways, and it's been so good for so many of my clients that have been through it too. And it's such a great opportunity to meet some amazing people, immerse yourself in a new community, and push yourself in a completely different way and really shift your focus when it comes to training, when all you've ever known is training to make yourself look a certain way. And that, that goal serves a purpose through certain seasons of our life, absolutely. And, there's nothing wrong with having goals to build muscle tissue or lose body fat. We all know that building muscle tissue is really supportive of our health, for example. And we know that in some cases, losing body fat is going to be supportive of some people's health. And so there's nothing wrong with those goals, but one, we can still progress with those goals whilst training in a slightly more functional way and incorporating different movements if you should want to do that. And second of all, if you're in a position where you've been chasing those goals for years on end and it's now got to a point where you do feel a bit stagnant and you don't really have so much passion for building muscle tissue or losing body fat anymore. You want to give your training a bit more meaning. You want to celebrate what you're actually capable of and really improve your health beyond what training for hypertrophy can do, then this transition might be the thing for you. And so I wanted in this podcast to talk through some of the things that I've learned going through this transition and taking lots of clients through it. And I wanted to address some common concerns and obstacles and challenges that can come up to begin with. And then in a future episode, I'm going to talk more specifically about the ins and outs of programming and things like that. So one of the common concerns when it comes to this transition is the loss of muscle tissue or the overall change in body composition that can come with this transition, the fear of fat gain as well. Now, the first thing I think it's really important to recognize is that your body may change as you go through this transition. It may. But if you can shift your focus to new measures of progress, acknowledge your value outside of your external appearance, and think about the example that you want to set to those that are important to you, whether those people be your clients, if you're a coach yourself, or your children, if you're a mom or a dad, or whether it be your peers and or your audience on social media, whoever it may be, if you can think about the example you want to set to those people, that can be one thing that really gives your goals meaning and helps you realize like what's important. And if you can celebrate your body for what it allows you to do and experience rather than reducing your value down to what it looks like, that can be something that makes, any body composition related changes that do occur, something that doesn't affect you anywhere near as much and doesn't affect your sense of self-worth or the value that you hold in your own opinion. I also want to stress that, I think that when we come from a background of bodybuilding and trying to maximally develop muscle tissue and, be as lean as possible through certain phases, we can sometimes end up convincing ourselves that as much muscle tissue as physically possible is the best thing we could ever do, and as minimal body fat as possible is the best thing we could ever do. And that almost becomes something which is it's almost a taught belief. It's something that we learn throughout bodybuilding because that's the criteria that we are judged against. It's not always actually our own preference. And so something that if you make this transition from bodybuilding to functional fitness, you can start to challenge those thoughts and beliefs. You can start to challenge that narrative. You're no longer going to be judged against this bodybuilding criteria, or you no longer need to judge yourself against that. So it's an opportunity to really get curious about, is that really what you prefer, or is it what you've been taught is what you should be striving for? And actually recognizing what your preferences are can be one of the most rewarding things ever, and challenging kind of the conditioning that has been built up over time, the beliefs that have been sort of put on you can be such a transformative process. So this is a great opportunity to get curious on that. I have certainly come from a background, when I was competing in bodybuilding, of thinking that more muscle tissue, less body fat is absolutely better. And my opinion on that, in terms of my own personal preference of my own body, has changed. I no longer really care about having as much muscle tissue as physically possible. I do want to carry a good amount of muscle tissue, absolutely. And I don't want to carry excess body fat to the point it impairs my health or my performance. But you don't have to, you do either of those things when you're making this transition. You can still build or maintain muscle tissue if you want to. Like functional fitness, the kind of definition of that belongs to you. You define what that is. It's just a slight shift in terms of, functional fitness for the majority of us will not be in line with training for bodybuilding or training for maximal physique development and nothing else. But you can still build muscle tissue whilst progressing with, for example, your fitness levels, your overall strength, your power development, that kind of thing. Like all of these things can be um pursued together if you're smart with the way that you go about it. You maybe periodize your approach slightly, and you're smart with how you structure your training over the week and with your nutrition alongside that. So there's a few kind of points in there. One is that what you believe is your preference could have been something that's been kind of enforced on you through your background of training for physique development or competing in bodybuilding, whichever background you've come from or your clients have come from, or even just the environment you've put yourself in on social media. Like it's so influential, it can really have an impact on your beliefs of what success is to you. So let's use this as an opportunity to get curious about that and to think, okay, is this really my preference, or is it something that's been kind of forced on me, or that is it something that I've kind of adopted because of the environments that I've been in? So that's one point. Second point is you don't have to let go of all physique goals to train in a functional way. So that's another point. Um, and your body also will, regardless of what your goals are, regardless of whether you're training for physique development or you're training in a more functional way and you're progressing with lots of different training styles, lots of different modalities, your body will fluctuate throughout your life. And that's something that we all need to come to accept. And I think it would do us all good to place a little bit less focus on how we look and give our training much more meaning beyond that. And that's what functional fitness is all about. Like it's about, in my opinion, your training enabling you to feel your best self, to function as your best self in your daily life, whatever that looks like to you, whether that be going on bike rides, whether that be hiking, whether it be running, whether it be performing in a sport. You define what functional fitness is to you, but what it means is that your training, it supports your performance in your daily life, essentially, and supports your function in whatever you're doing, whatever that function looks like to you. So that's something to bear in mind. You can also take a gradual approach So to, for example, keep some hypertrophy work in your program, if you wish to do so for peace of mind and so that it doesn't feel like so much of a shock to the system. But what I will also say is that, like I said before, you can still progress with hypertrophy whilst training in a functional way. And also, most people do still retain a really decent amount of muscle tissue if they're smart with their approach whilst making this transition, including myself. I've retained a really decent amount of muscle tissue. I'm really happy with the amount of muscle tissue I have. It definitely serves its purpose. And you're not going to carry an unproductive or an unhealthy amount of excess body fat if your training is productive and if you're fueling your sessions properly whilst nourishing your body. So try and get curious on like your drive, I guess, to carry maximal muscle tissue and absolute minimal body fat, because it's worth questioning, is that really allowing you to live the life that you want to live and to perform the way that you want to perform? Would it actually serve you better to focus on feeling your best self on a daily basis, performing at your best, both physically and cognitively, and functioning as your best, and letting your body fat fall wherever it falls as a result of that? Because if you do that, you're not going to be carrying excess body fat. You're going to be carrying a healthy amount, and your muscle tissue is not going to go to none if you're training hard. So, could we maybe accept wherever our bodies fall when we are living the life that we want to live and we are performing and functioning as we want to perform and function? That would be my question. Some other obstacles and challenges that we may see as we make this transition, or our clients may see, is that new movements will feel really strange and will be really hard to begin with. And you may need to work on mobility to enable you to get into certain positions to be able to execute new movements. For example, getting into a front rack position for a front squat, or for the beginning of like a push press, a jerk, an overhead press if you want to incorporate those styles of movements. And I remember the first time I ever went to a CrossFit class, we had in the session a barbell overhead press, and I could not, for the life of me, get the barbell to rest on my shoulders. There's not a chance I had the upper body mobility to be able to do that. I remember the bar was basically hovering like about chin height, and I was doing my barbell overhead press from there because I could not get it into front rack position. So you're not alone if that's something that you're struggling with, and you absolutely can improve that. Over time, I've now got to a point where my front rack position is pretty comfortable for me. It feels really good. I'm cool with it in a front squat, overhead press, push press, jerks, all of it, cool. So if you're not there right now and it feels really hard, you will get there. It will just take time and patience. And I think that is one of the biggest things when you're making this transition, is that you will have to put into practice a lot of patience. And one of the best things you can do is fall in love with the process of self-improvement and progressing with your training, and embrace the hard, like recognize it will be so rewarding if you can push through how hard it feels and get to a point where you can perform those movements really, really, really well. The pride you will feel at that moment is absolutely incredible. So don't sit and beat yourself up. Don't dwell in it. Don't linger in the fact it feels really hard right now. Don't let that defeat you. Push through and recognize that if you do push through, it will be the most rewarding thing ever. And we don't grow in our comfort zones. So reminding yourself of that can be super powerful. But if you want a chat about that, just drop me a message and I can always send over some exercises that might help with your front rack mobility if that is something that you're struggling with. You may also, in line with that, in order to be able to perform movements that you're really unfamiliar with, you may have to work on muscle groups that you haven't worked on before, or work on engaging muscles that you haven't really had to engage very much before. An example of that is in the bikini category. I didn't train really my abdominal muscles very much. And the reason for that is because we were told, you don't want your midsection to be bulky, you don't want to build muscle tissue in that area, you want your waist to be as tiny as possible. But then that sometimes makes some of these big compound movements quite difficult. Or even I remember actually when I first started doing some CrossFit style movements and WODs and things like that and Metcons, when I was to do like ab mat sit-ups and things like that, I could do them fine for like 10 reps, but then after that, I'd just completely lose it and I'd have to rest and split them up because I just hadn't really trained my core in that way before. So yeah, it's getting used to training different muscle groups in different ways and moving in different ways, and that's going to feel really unfamiliar at first. And it might even feel wrong to do certain movements in certain ways. So if it does, try and persevere with that because it will just take time for you to get comfortable in these new positions and also build strength in these new positions. And that's where you'll really have to strip those movements back and leave your ego at the door and start with lower loads in order to be able to execute movements properly, reduce your injury risk, keep injuries at bay, and progress efficiently. So don't get carried away with like using really heavy loads. I know that can be tempting when you've done lots of, hypertrophy work using heavy loads. You're so used to those movement patterns, you've been doing them a long time, you've built really good strength in those movement patterns, but then when you're moving over to a different training style, you're trying new movements, you really need to leave your ego at the door and see this as right, this is a new challenge, it's a new stimulus. I can't be comparing the loads that I'm using in these new sessions to what I used to use when I was bodybuilding. And I really need to strip it back in order to do this properly. And that's something that's quite difficult to get your head around and can be a really humbling process to go through. But I promise you, if you are patient with it, again, it will be absolutely worth it and you'll thank yourself for stripping your loads back and doing things properly, really nailing your squat patterns, really nailing your pressing movements, your pulling movements, different pressing and pulling movements from what you've done in bodybuilding in order to get them right before you start to progress with your load. So please leave your ego at the door and be super patient with it. It will also take a while to get used to the change in structure of your week and the new measures of progress that you will have to utilize. So when it comes to like the structure of your week, for example, you might be used to doing, I don't know, pull push legs up or lower. As a simple example, if you've come from a background of training for physique development, including if you've been competing or if you've just been training for general physique development, that might have been a kind of split that you've come from, or it might have been something like lower upper. As you change to train for function, and if you want to incorporate new movements and different styles of training, you will find that when you initially introduce those new movements, new different training styles, different training modalities, you're working on different energy systems, you'll probably find that you're quite sore to begin with. If you've never ran and you go out on a run, you're going to be really sore off the back of that. If you've never done a clean and you go and do a clean, you're going to be really sore off the back of it. So it's really important to leave adequate recovery time between sessions when you're introducing a new stimulus. And so you may have to begin with, reduce training volume, reduce training frequency in order to be able to recover and therefore adapt to your training in a positive manner. So again, patience comes into this, and it's really important to recognize this is something that you're new at. And so you may have to drop training frequency down initially whilst your body adapts to this new stimulus. And then you can start to creep it back up again further down the line. But it's so, so important to be patient with that. And when it comes to measures of progress, so whereas you might have, if you've come from a bodybuilding background, been quite focused on things like progress pictures, your scale weight, measurements, that kind of thing. When you're training for function, think about what that means to you and then set measures of progress in line with that. So it could be that you want to get better at running and you want to improve your fitness levels. And so initially, you might just strive to be able to run a 5K easily at a conversational pace without your heart rate skyrocketing through the roof. That might be your initial goal. Cool. You're using that 5K as a measure of progress. You may also use things like health-based measures of progress if your health is something that you've struggled with in the past. So that's always something to take into account. And you may even use things like training videos to track your progress. This is something that I do with a lot of my clients, especially those moving towards a slightly more functional approach who are incorporating new movements. We'll look at the movements we've incorporated in a video when we first introduce them. I'll give them feedback. They'll implement that feedback and we'll look at that progress over time, and that becomes a fantastic measure of progress without them having to let their ego get in the way and getting really carried away with things like load. Because if we place too much emphasis on load too early on, form is going to be compromised, quality of movement is going to be compromised, the injury risk is going to go up, and we're not going to see that long-term progression that we're striving for. So it's really important to think outside of the box with this. Yes, the numbers that we log when we're training, the number of reps we're performing, the load that we're using, the time it takes to complete a session, all of these things are important to take into account, yes, but we also need to pay attention to quality and also how something feels. So if, for example, you do a 5K on week one and it feels really hard, you're having to alternate between running and walking, heart rate is all over the place, pace is all over the place, and then week 10, that 5K, you've been able to run the whole thing at a conversational pace, heart rate has stayed under control, it feels good, you don't feel wrecked, that is a huge win. So feeling needs to come into it as well. Or, intensity-based feedback to some extent. So yeah, shifting that focus can be quite difficult to begin with when you've been so used to using numerical progress in terms of scale weight and in terms of measurements and looking at progress pictures. And, in bodybuilding, you might have been able to, because you've been quite an experienced physique competitor potentially, or if you've even come from a background of just training for hypertrophy for years, you might be very used to seeing gradual progressive overload over time on paper. And then when you initially get into training for function, you might have to just let that go in that initial period, leave your ego at the door, not look for that numerical based progression, but focus on progress by feel to begin with. And that can be quite difficult to wrap your head around, but using you might even use an RP scale, you might just make notes on your sessions, use training videos, things like that can be incredibly valuable when it comes to monitoring your progress in those initial periods of time. And then when you do get a little bit more advanced, you might then start to look at time taken to complete a session. You would still take into account that intensity-based feedback and how a session feels, but you might then start to take into account a little bit more the loads that you're using. Might progress with those over time, the number of rounds or reps you were able to complete, the time it took you to complete something. But it's really important to earn the right to get there when it comes to all things functional fitness or hybrid, if you want to call it that. Nutrition for performance also looks quite different to nutrition for physique development. There are definitely some similarities in terms of there is still great benefits that come with getting regular protein feedings in, for example, or staying well hydrated, getting your fruit and veg in. However, much more energy is in a lot of cases required to support performance-based goals And especially if you're incorporating a lot of conditioning or a lot of running, you will have to consume a lot more energy, especially from carbohydrate. And typical bodybuilding behaviors like opting for low calorie alternatives of a lot of foods or plenty of high volume foods will have to be challenged, because if you're opting for the low calorie alternative of everything, you're likely not going to be able to get enough energy in to support performance goals. And if you're consuming a lot of high volume foods, again, you're going to run into that same challenge. But on top of that, consuming too many high volume, like really high fiber foods, especially before a training window, can cause a lot of discomfort when we're going running or we're doing other conditioning pieces and that kind of thing. So it's really important to recognize that a slightly different strategy from a nutrition perspective is required. And sometimes that can be quite difficult psychologically to wrap your head around, which is one of the reasons it's really important to get the right support when you're going through a transition like this, to be able to change your approach and make sure that you don't run into health consequences as a result of underfueling. Because we know, if you've come from a background of physique development, you probably know that underfueling can lead to fatigue, poor physical and cognitive function, poor overall recovery, poor performance, and a whole host of health issues such as irregular or absent cycles, poor hormone health, etc. But what we don't realize is how demanding training for performance can be sometimes, and quite how much fuel is needed. And it can sometimes, especially I think as women in bodybuilding, we have often been exposed to very low energy intakes. And so it can sometimes be quite difficult to wrap your head around eating quite a bit more to be able to perform well. And there can be a lot of fears that come up when making that transition, such as the fear of gaining body fat and that kind of thing. And so the right guidance is essential when you're making this transition to help you through that and to make sure that you're not underfueling and you don't get stuck in your old ways in terms of nutrition. And it's important to as well take quite a gradual approach and meet yourself where you're at, rather than going from one extreme to the other with your training volume and intensity. It will be a massive shock to the system at first, and higher levels of muscle soreness will likely be present in comparison to what you're used to as well. So, again, tying in with that earlier point, you will probably have to have more frequent rest days and to begin with, and then as you adapt, you can incorporate a bit more training. So, it's important to recognize that, but also it's really important to manage intensity to make sure that that muscle soreness isn't debilitating. Because let me tell you, from when I first started training and incorporating some kind of CrossFit style movements and going to some classes, I was so sore. I was in the bin. I remember there was a point where I was having an Epsom salt bath like most nights because I was wrecked. And that's because I went in and did too frequent CrossFit style training, a mixture of classes and like open gym sessions, but I did too much too soon of a new training style. Whereas if I was working with a client now that I have the knowledge that I have, I would take a much more gradual approach to ensure that they weren't in the bin straight off the bat, and that they were able to tolerate what they were doing. And another mistake as well in CrossFit classes, just whilst I'm on the subject of them, and that's not to say you should all go and do CrossFit classes, but this is just an example from my own experience of the impact that a change in training style can have, is that it generally tends to be quite a competitive environment, and it can be very easy to get carried away with that and try and compete with these people that have been doing CrossFit for years, especially if you're someone who's come from a competitive background, a sporting background. You're probably going to be quite prone to getting into that mindset, just like I was. And you are going to end up wrecked if you do that, let me tell you. Remember to manage your, and I know it's so hard, but it's so important to manage your intensity when you're first getting into these things and meet yourself where you're at rather than trying to compete with those around you. And that even applies for when you're more experienced because your your ability to perform is going to be affected by so many different factors and variables that are out of your control. So you need to focus on your capacity on each day and take into account those variables and your circumstances when you're going into a session and setting your intentions with intensity and with your performance so that you don't end up shooting yourself in the foot and driving yourself into a hole because your capabilities on one day are going to be very different to the next. And it's really important to remember that. So I really hope that this podcast has given you some food for thought and helped kind of address some of the common things that it's important to take into account when you're making the transition from training for physique development to training for function, and helped maybe tackle some of the common worries that can come up when you're making this transition. But if you have any questions off the back of this that you would like me to cover in future episodes, whether it's on this topic or whether it's something else, I would love to hear from you. And if you've made this switch or you're in the process of making this transition, DM me your biggest challenge because I would love to feature some of your real struggles in a future episode. And I'm also going to cover some of this more specifics in terms of how to approach programming when transitioning from bodybuilding to functional fitness and that kind of thing. So if you have any questions on any of that, please drop me a message and let's chat. It'd be so lovely to hear from you. And I hope you will have a wonderful rest of your week. I will put a link to my email list in the description down below. It's free to join and it will be a pleasure to have you as part of my community. So make sure you head down to the link below and join so that you don't miss out on any helpful information.